Let me find the guy. Hello, hello, hello. Ladies and gentlemen, hello, how is everybody? How are you? Happy New Year. I think we'll be saying this in like mid-November at some point. It's wonderful to see you all. Welcome everybody to the first Insaka of the year. Welcome to Insaka veterans. We see you and we honor you. Welcome to our guests all the way from London. Welcome to our guests that have come all the way from Kenya. And welcome to our guests that are neighbors from across the road. So warm welcome, everybody. This is a special Insaka. For those who haven't been before, I will just make a quick introduction to the Africa Oxford Initiative. And on behalf of my colleagues who are around the room, welcome you to join us and have engaging conversations with us even beyond today. The Africa Oxford Initiative is really a platform that draws together all things Africa in Oxford. Our mission is to make Africa a strategic priority for Oxford and for other global research enterprises. And we do this through various programs, including scholarships for African students at Oxford, research fellowships for academic and research partners from across the continent, as well as an innovation platform to support the budding entrepreneurship ecosystem across the continent. So do go to our website and read a lot more about AfOx. Do join the mailing list so you can be invited for a lot more engaging conversation. Today, I'm not the star of the show. I'm going to invite the stars of the show to lead us through the conversation today. It's a very special Insaka. Normally, we have these gatherings where we talk about issues that are relevant for Africa's development. Normally, we have one guest speaker or two guest speakers. Today, it's a star-studded panel, and we are ever so delighted to welcome everybody, our speakers who've joined us today. In honor of our AfOx spirit of collaborations. We're delighted to partner with the Africa Practice to deliver this Insaka, and I'm honored to have the director of the Africa Practice, Natalie Moore, run and moderate the sessions today. And before we go too far, allow me to humbly welcome the Kenya High Commissioner, Ambassador Manoa Esipisu, to welcome us into this session and to tell us why this conversation on African women narratives is important for Kenya and important for Africa more broadly. Karibu sana.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank Dr. McKenna and AfOx for inviting me to this Insaka, and to thank Gina for getting us all here in this room. It's my pleasure to join you as we celebrate one of our country's most inspirational people, Gina here. Many in the business and public affairs sectors know Gina Dean for her impactful engagements over the years in the corporate communications landscape, in the humanitarian space, and in the space where just good hearts matter. Her skills and experience in strategic communications have influenced many brands and continue to impact how we do business in the private sector. And as far as a patriot, Gina has encouraged and even taken center stage in various charity outreach programs, touching the hearts and minds of those she has interacted with. She might not remember this, but the very first time I worked with Gina was in the early 90s. I was a Barclays chair visiting Nairobi, and she took me to a farm in Kiambu to test tea and to show this guy that we actually grow this stuff. Her book, Daughter of Africa, an autobiography, is a timely addition to the valuable contributions that she continues to make in advancing the welfare and image of our continent. I am therefore proud of you, Gina, for your innovation, for your resilience, for your determination in making our world a better place. I'm equally proud of the effort that you have put towards publishing this autobiography. As you know, many pioneers have not done so from our part of the world. And majority never get the opportunity to document their lives' journey in their own lifetime. And while we may remember some of what they did, we often miss out on their whole life story because it was never documented or shared or even celebrated as we witness today. So launching your book speaks to the need for a larger repository of experiences of those who have dared to dream and to make those dreams a reality. It is also a well of knowledge, the book that is, for those who are keen in venturing in the marketplace and particularly in the public affairs space. Most importantly, it is also a rich record of lessons in resilience for those young people, young women especially, who will apply its gems and use it to dream dreams as big or bigger than yours. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll agree, you might not agree, but I hope you do, that it takes a safe, progressive, and abundant environment for women to thrive. Gina Dean's experiences tell of a continent that is progressively broadening its social, economic, and political bounds. Certainly, we think that's what is happening in our country. We are moving forward inch by inch every day in this space. and we continue to work to accommodate and empower our women and girls. It is also about a community that continues to support its women as they maximize on their political and indeed every aspiration. I should appreciate the role of sound policy and institutional frameworks in promoting the equality and empowerment of all. In Kenya, where Gina Dean spends most of her life in the sun, as compared to some of you guys here in Oxford. We pride ourselves in a robust constitution that recognizes the value that everyone, including women, bring to the society. And as a country, we are ensuring that girls have access to quality education, quality healthcare, and that women can play an active role in advancing the social, economic, political, and cultural development of our country. And just recently, President William Ruto has added to the number of institutions that have been charged with expanding this women's space by the creation of the Women's Rights Agency in his office. It has a mandate to promote and protect the rights of women, and it is one among the many women-led, women empowerment institutions within this administration. Let me conclude by reading an excerpt from Gina's book. At its foreword, Arunma, who is here with us, writes, "The world needs more people like Gina, someone who dare pave a path for herself, yet never become indifferent to the struggles of others, someone who has fought for her gender and race, yet is blind to the race and gender of others, someone who believes that we will all have the power to do great things no matter where we come from, someone who has faith in humanity as a whole. And to all women and leaders, Gina's autobiography shows that you can have it all against all odds while maintaining the highest principles." So congratulations once again, Gina, for your book and on this launch here in Oxford. You know how hallowed this place is. And we do hope that it can be an inspiration for others to continue this path, to share their journey, to share their knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can now see why Kenyans all over the world wear their Kenyan band no matter where they go. They proudly, you can see them, Thank you very much, Ambassador Manoa. It gives me great pleasure now to welcome Natalie, the Director of the Africa Practice, to lead the rest of the discussion. Very excited for this. Warm welcome.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much to everyone for making the time to be here today. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and to be on a panel with such impressive women. The event is being live streamed, so we are joined by people beyond this room, and I'm hoping it will be a really interesting conversation. So we will start by the conversation on the panel, but we very much welcome questions, comments as we go, and so it can become a really vibrant evening together. Gina, I was going to introduce Gina, but the High Commissioner has done so in such a way that I don't think I could possibly follow. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you today, Gina. Arunma Ote is here, executive in residence at the Said Business School. She has an extremely distinguished career at very senior leadership levels from the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Nigerian Stock Exchange. So I won't try and do her CV justice in 1 minute, but very delighted to be with you today. And Sabrina, thank you so much for joining us. Sabrina is specializing in human rights law. She studied at Oxford and is doing research into migration and refugee rights, and we'll cover some of those issues in the course of the conversation. Gina's produced a video, which I'm hoping we can show now to frame the discussion. Lovely.
But what are your dreams? Because everything I've done are things that I dreamt about. When I left my very well-paying and very stable job when I was working at Barclays, everyone thought, you're crazy, like, why are you leaving? And, you know, being an entrepreneur is wilderness. But then I realized that actually I was the wilderness and that I was very comfortable in that wilderness.
I've just been nominated one of the most influential 100 women in Africa. So they see a beautiful picture of Musa and they're like, wow, most influential. But what does that even mean? How have I journeyed to be there? And that for me is really the importance of telling the story. Where we fell, where we failed, where we achieved, how we became successful, who was there to help us success.
As soon as I left home, I knew I'm coming back home at some point. I was never going to be the one that goes and disappears and never comes back. So I always knew that whatever I am filling my bucket with, it's for me to come back to Kenya to use and do. So I don't think I'd be this far if I hadn't honed my skills in the US.
My story was the story of many other women and men out there, and people needed a place to say, oh, I thought it was just me. Oh, this is what I went through too. Oh, our stories are so identical.
How do we get more women on the continent to tell their stories, Pat? What do you think we need to do?
I mean, to be honest, as I sit here, if Patricia can write a book, anybody can write a book. I think it's owning your story, and I think that's the big step.
And for people to know that you don't have to have built a plane for you to be a leader and for you to tell your story in a beautiful way. Sometimes you could be doing very small things that are building momentum to something big, but if nobody is there to hear your story, how will it change the world?
For a lot of women, maybe they'll say, I wasn't really allowed to speak, or it hasn't been normalized, our agency, our ability to tell our stories. We almost don't feel like we have permission. It is changing a lot now. But I think in women seeing some of what we've done, I know a lot of them, it already plants the seed in them that, oh, I can actually do this.
Women carry this continent. During COVID, who did the most work? It is the women. And we need to hear the stories, how they did it, how they continue to do it.
It's about time other women realized we're women just like them. We have the same problems, we're human, you know, we're not superhuman.
Documenting stories or having a hub of stories where African women across ages, across physical, geographical locations can find inspiration that relates specifically to them is very important because we don't have enough of that.
Great. So it's incredibly inspiring to hear these different women's voices, but they're actually being heard now as a result of Gina telling her own story and then sharing that platform with other women. So Gina, perhaps you could share just why was it important to you to tell your story now? What were you hoping to achieve?
Thank you so much. Asante sana, thank you very much in Swahili to our High Commissioner. Mano, I remember going to the farm. I remember that cup of tea, and we were much younger then. But we've done well. I'm really excited to be here at Oxford today, an institution I know too well. My daughter, Professor Natalia Dinkariuki, who is here, did her 3 degrees here. My son, Nathan, is a scout at Oxford United. And as a family, we have spent a lot of time here. I think I was here probably more than my kids at some point. I've ended up with a lot of their friends as my friends. I think for me, what's important today is that this is the first place in the UK that we're launching the book, and for the reasons that I've said before, Kevin Marsh and I sit on the British High Commissioner's Innovation Board together, and so Oxford really is a very, very special place. But Let me say that I'm inspired by the story of the young Nigerian lady, the first Black African to obtain a degree from Oxford University. And at that time, she said that to be a student here, she felt like she was seen as a curio and not as a human being. So, and that was many, many, many years ago. And indeed, over the years, many more Africans have shown us what is possible, African women. I will go first to the woman in Ethiopia, Tayo, the third wife of the Emperor Menelik of Ethiopia, who led the anti-colonial resistance during the 19th century scramble for Africa that ensured that Italy did not colonize Ethiopia. We've got Wangari Maathai, the Kenyan environmental activist and the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, who fought to ensure harmony between humanity and nature. Winnie Mandela, who for 27 years showed the strength of women as she fought the apartheid system, and many would argue kept the great Nelson Mandela name alive in South Africa and beyond. Fela Kuti's mother, who was really the incredibly a political campaigner, and the power behind her great son, who supported her son's criticism of Nigerian military governments before succumbing to wounds after a military raid on family property. We've got women like Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the Liberian politician, elected female head of state in Africa, who finally brought peace and stability to a troubled nation. We've got women whose stories have been told. But as Wangari Maathai said, the higher you go, the fewer women there are. And fortunately for the women that I've just mentioned, we know their stories. I've written Daughter of Africa for the millions of women who are the unsung heroes of our great continent. For women who, like me, get asked, and I represent my country many times, where are you really from? And I think we've got a friend of mine here, Kimberly Leonard, anchor with Sky, who's Kenyan, who probably gets asked exactly the same question, where are you really from? So we represent the diversity of the continent. I think there are Africans that look like Kimberly, there are Africans that look like me, there are Africans that look like Aruma here, but we're all Africans from an incredible continent. I've written Daughter of Africa for the 17-year-old girl who had been married off as a child bride and who had been rescued by the Samburu Girls Foundation, whom I support, who came running after me and said, Gina, I'm going to be just like you when I grow up. I've written Daughter of Africa because, as Chinua Achebe once remarked, until the lion learns how to tell the tale, tales of the hunter will always be glorified. I've written Daughter of Africa because I didn't want to be, as the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o said, we can only see ourselves through European eyes at the minimum. This makes us look at Africa with the eyes of an outsider, thus in effect giving up on our responsibility to secure the continent for African people. I wanted to tell my story, our story, from an African child's eyes for other women, the sisters, the caregivers, helpers, and so forth, whose stories have gone unnoticed because they have not had the opportunities or the platform that a few, as you and I have, to tell our stories. The ones who won't get to come to Oxford to tell their stories. To continue to a positive, authentic narrative about us women who are resilient, resourceful, imaginative, caring, and many other adjectives, but mostly who in our little corners, in our bedrooms, in our kitchens, and rarely on global stages have shaped the global agenda that men have used as their terrain. But we are here now. So we intend to make ourselves heard. I'm Gina Dinkariuki, a proud Kenyan, an African, not only because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me. I'm really honored to be here to share a platform with another exemplary daughter of Africa, my friend, the lady who wrote my foreword, Aruma Oche. Aruma, so good to be here. But I wanted to ask you a question. When I go to Nigeria, and I do often, if you look at the newspapers, at the end of the newspapers, there's pages and pages of tributes to wonderful women. There are billboards that are taken when a woman dies. We never hear those stories when the women are alive. What do you think that's the reason for that is?
First of all, this is so emotional for me, and for all the Kenyans who think that Gina is Kenyan. Many of us Nigerians think Gina is Nigerian. And I think there are many more of us, so we will probably win. So for me, I think the starting point is really to just go back to the basics. What does storytelling do? People say it entertains, it educates. I would add that it empowers. And every time I read a story like yours, I feel empowered. It's also just around, what is a legacy? How do you pass on values and behaviors? And so as I look back on when you shared with me, and I was one of those who had the opportunity to read this book before everyone, I thought to myself, oh my God, it's not just about Nigeria or Kenya. It's about the fact that there are not as many Africans who know, who care, and who love Africa, who are telling the story. And today I was just saying to myself, I need to find a statistics that's jarring. And I'm not going to name the Western nation, but apparently African news in that country that is negative is 70%, and positive news is 30%. I was sharing that with a friend earlier, and the person says, oh, they thought it would even be worse. So despite all of the focus on people understanding Africa better, in a sense, that is not happening. So for me, having someone like you who cares for Africa, but who has authentic stories to share about Africa is absolutely meaningful. And maybe we will start that journey of having more women do the same because of the way that you've approached it. Because if I'm a banker, I can connect with you. If I'm in manufacturing, I can connect with you because your story is about being a game changer who has supported African organizations around Africa to basically tell their stories. So each one of us can connect with you from a business point of view. You've talked about, we talk about Nigeria, which is why I call Dina my sister, but also call her the pride of Africa. She talks about Nigeria more authentically than many Nigerians. So for me, so that's one. The second is, of course, a woman. As we think about the fact that in this world that we're in, everybody understands that it is important that all of what the world has is used to solve some of the largest challenges that the world has, whether it's climate crisis, whether it's poverty, or whatever it is. And we all know what the stats are, but my favorite example is always McKinsey, that's said in 2015 that in 2025 we could add $28 trillion to GDP. So that's US and China GDP, basically. And we're 2 years to 2025, and I think we're further behind. Yeah. But people not understanding the value that women bring to society in various ways, in leadership, in politics, means that they're not able to allow women to excel. And that's why I like stories like yours. That's why I like all the tributes. But unfortunately, I'm glad that yours is being told while you're still alive, fortunately, and it's not being told, as you said, in Nigeria, where we have all these pages that we take out and glorify others. The other thing I was going to say, I mean, you were listing your own women. So forgive me, one of the women that I appreciate very much is Mary Kingsley. Gina and I belong to the board of the Royal African Society. And the reason people may have heard me talk about Mary Kingsley previously, is that in 1901, almost 122 years ago, the Royal African Society was set up in memory of this woman. Why was it set up in memory of her? Because she said she didn't come to Africa to teach or preach. She wanted to learn about Africa and promote Africa. And today, more than 120 years afterwards, this organization is amplifying Africa's voice through various ways, including the Africa Arguments platform that allows people to basically tell stories from the African perspective, that has more than 1.5 million users. You mentioned Wangari Maathai. When I first encountered this woman, I was so emotional. I mean, look at where we are about climate. But 46 years ago, Wangari Maathai had the Green Belt movement. At that time, most people weren't aware of the importance of conserving our planet. And thank God she's a Nobel Prize, a Peace Prize winner. She's the first African woman. That is an amazing story. Gina, my third woman is you.
Oh, thank you.
And I say that for many reasons. Because you talked about Natalia and Nathan, what you've done with them, your children, with your husband, with me, with everybody who encounters you, is to help us realize our potential. What you've done for companies is to help those companies realize their potential. What you've done for countries, whether it's Ghana, whether it's Kenya, or home country, whether it's Nigeria, is help those countries realize their potential. But I'm sure many people in this room were not even aware of it, because you're very humble, you're a quiet operator. And I hope that through your story, that people can aspire in their own way to make a difference, in their own profession to make a difference. So yes, I don't want to see those billboards about how great women have been after the fact. I want to be in conversations with people like you, where I can celebrate you, where I can thank you, but more importantly, where I can inspire others to say, how can I be like Gina? How can I make a difference to society? Sorry that I was long, but this is emotional for me, as you know. Yeah, so.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both. You've touched on some really important themes there. And one of the things that you both talked about is the difficulty sometimes of African women's voices being heard when and where they should be heard. And I think that's sometimes structural. I think that's about who tells those stories and who decides whose stories are told. And that could be media. And we could ask ourselves how many African women are owning media titles, not just writing for them, not just editing, not just producing, but owning. How many African women are sitting in the newsrooms at the global media stations and titles, deciding which stories get published and where? Just because a story is run on page 28 of a paper and there's a tiny paragraph doesn't mean it's going to have any kind of resonance. It matters where and how it's told. So I think until we start looking at the gatekeepers to the story, nothing is going to necessarily change. You can have these really inspirational stories that just can't get out there. Sabrina, it's something that you and I were talking about the other day.
Yeah, we were talking about. I think it is very important for us to note that it's not necessarily, the problem isn't that the stories are not there. And I think the framing the stories as saying whose stories are being told is somewhat problematic, because it's not that the stories are not being told, it's that they're not being heard. And I think that framing of the question in itself, I think it renders the subjects, mainly the women, unintelligible or oblivious to their own experiences, or silent, but they're not silent. They're constantly speaking, and then the onus is then placed on them to either speak louder, and then you have all these discourses of empowering them. And I think in itself it is problematic, because why should we empower them? They are speaking. What we should be doing instead is listening to them, right? And you gave a good example of like environmentalists who brought, but like it's not even, we've used the term environmentalist, right? And in itself, I think it's been sort of professionalized, but we had indigenous communities who had their own practices, right, that were set out to protect the environment. But because they didn't fall as a valid mode of storytelling or communicating, then they weren't taken, their cultures were speaking, but because their cultures didn't have any capitalistic value, then they were silenced. And then today we turn around and we're like, oh, technically the culling that they were doing was actually protecting the environment. And all the wildfires we're having now is because you're now stopping them and fining them. It's sort of like we're 2 steps behind just because we're not listening. And if we just took that time to listen, then surely we could actually then, there could be real authentic storytelling here. But yeah, I think it is very important for us to focus on these stories being heard and placing the onus on the listener and not the person telling the story, because they're constantly speaking but just not being heard. In terms of who is shaping these hegemonic discourses, of course it's the elites, right? We need to look at the relationships between money and power and the history in terms of the modes of storytelling, right? We need to talk about how storytelling in itself has been gendered. So I think one striking example I can think of, it always like baffles me, but the CIA operates as an agency that collects data and intelligence, right? But then when women do the same within their communities, it is demonized. Gossiping is demonized, right? But then in itself, it did serve a purpose, but it just wasn't valid for the elites. In fact, it was a threat to them because they were the very subjects of the intelligence. So I think it's important for us to then think of how certain modes of storytelling have been demonized so as to silence and to also not further the interests of the groups that are speaking. Yeah, I guess.
I think you've picked up on something really interesting there. And sometimes when women share their stories, it can feel discomforting. And so to minimize them, people say, oh, she's being too emotional. And so it's an easy way just to say, I'm not ready to listen. And we've put it on the slide for later, but this is an organic conversation. We're hoping that actually you'll add to it. So please feel free, if you've got a comment or a question, please put your hand up, and I'm sure we've got somebody with a mic that can come to you. But this idea about, if with storytelling can be a powerful tool for advocacy, for change making. And when you come in to do advocacy, you need an evidence base. You need to be master of what you're talking about. And often that comes from data, and often that comes from statistics and research. But as Sabrina said, sometimes it comes from your mastery of your subject, and it doesn't have to come from academic literature or business intel. It can come from actually personal, authentic experience, lived experience. And so I think what we look at in terms of what is an evidence base and how do you marry the need for emotion and authenticity and personal connection with a data-driven argument, that can be a difficult balance to strike.
I think I've really struggled with the idea of like evidence-based arguments, just because I think we really need to look at the history of what it means to have an evidence-based argument. I was reading about the history of quantitative research within social sciences, right? And when it first started, social sciences were predominantly qualitative, so it was more philosophical discussions. And then we had a lady named Jane Addams, right, who wanted to then introduce quantitative research, but it wasn't considered valid by the elites within the academy. So therefore, for the longest time during her academic career, her papers were not published. Her papers were not considered valid social science research. So when we say evidence-based arguments, it's not even a matter of like trying to validate a fact in itself, or I think most of the times it says it's framed in terms of we need to prove, or it's ultimately a good, but then in essence it's more about protecting the interests of what is evidence-based is really what their leads are defining as evidence-based. So I think I think for the most part, the idea of like evidence-based arguments has been framed so as to exclude certain voices from actually participating and to invalidate those experiences.
I think Sabrina has a point there, because I'm like, who is interpreting?
Yeah.
And so it goes back to your first question about the power structures.
Yes.
So who makes that choice about what is the evidence? So as you were framing the question, I was thinking, oh my God, yeah, who's interpreting? And so the power structures for me are still some of the biggest issues.
So let's talk about that. What are power structures? They're political power structures that determines policy making. They're financial power structures. It determines capital allocation. There are thousands of women. So Sub-Saharan Africa has 26% of women engaged in entrepreneurial activity. That's the highest rate anywhere else in the world. And yet, women-led and women-owned businesses across the continent are starved of capital. There's a $42 billion, apparently, annual deficit in funding for women-owned businesses. Why this disconnect? Why are women are clearly running good businesses. Why, you're somebody who's run extremely successful businesses and had it acquired very successfully.
So I think we're also held to different standard. My business got acquired 3 years ago by the largest PR company in the world. My due diligence took 2.5 years. A lady in London was acquired at about the same time as me. Her due diligence took 3 months. And so, there's a question of trust, is that, our African businesses, particularly African women businesses, not seen as trustworthy. So they have to do a very, very deep dive into your business. So it is interesting. I didn't realize the disconnect until I met the lady in London who I said, oh, so what was it like for you? And we were sharing, and suddenly she says, oh, it was really easy. It's really straightforward. It took 3 months. And me 2.5 years later thinking, really? But then you just realize that there is a difference, and it is based on trust and the fact that, you're giving them all this evidence every single day, and they're still like, okay, but going deeper and deeper. So definitely, women are held to a different standard.
Yeah.
Sorry, I mean, like another aspect of, I think, the data storytelling, like my background is in computer science, but also economics and development policy, is that like evidence is traumatizing. Like imagine, I don't know what it's like to be a Black person waking up every day in the West. Like I don't, because that kind of evidence, I don't need that in my life. And I wouldn't need that if I were a Black person, I think. So I think there's like what you said, really hit the nail for me, because like who's interpreting, and why isn't it enough that the data? Why is the plethora of data that's available about institutional racism in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Latin America, in Western Europe, why isn't that sufficient already? Like what more data do the power structures need? To be honest, like that's yeah.
And fascinating that you're making that point. It may be perceived differently as a Black woman if I was making that point. And that's part of why, I liked, Natalie, your one, I think it was the third one where you talked about a pathway to empathy and to understanding. So sharing storytelling allows people to feel more comfortable with each other. And, you mentioned trust. And for me as a woman, some of the people who've supported me through my career have been men, much more than women. And they've been allies because they've understood my story, sometimes way before I understood it, because I also do have my own biases. So both parties, the other person who is not categorized as Black, woman, white, minority, whatever. So that the value that storytelling brings beyond what it does for the individual, for me, is extremely important. Yes. And by the way, I was going to say that this is probably the first panel that I've been on that there are only women. So even that is part of the story.
No, I think you're right. I think for me, storytelling is a way to understand different people's perspectives. Part of the way policy is designed is as a result of the lack of listening to women's lived experiences. So we were just being mic'd up before the event, and it was clear that the mic had been made for men. And so just the way it attached was not designed for women. And there have been books written about, the Invisible Women book about the way the world is designed to exclude sometimes. And sometimes that's just by dint of how things have always been done. And sometimes it's intentional. Sometimes spaces are designed to exclude. Sometimes language is constructed to exclude. There can be codes, there can be particular jargon. And if you don't speak that jargon, you are excluded. So there's a move towards a more trust-based philanthropy model because there's a recognition that many women-run grassroots organizations have to spend an inordinate amount of time learning how to speak donor language so that they can fill out donor reports. And actually, if the move was more to trust-based philanthropy rather than needing these huge evidence bases and the relationships that these grassroots organizations are building within communities, the impact that they're having, if we could use narrative and storytelling and testimonials as a form of evidence, they wouldn't need to write those reports and they could just focus on what they're doing. So I think there's a piece around that. Were you going to ask a question? Oh, yes. Yes.
I think it's important to, I think in a lot of spaces that are often marginalized historically, this is speaking as somebody that's very acquainted, I would say, with Black American womanism and also queer and trans womanism as well. It's something that I've often seen or at least experienced in this turn in the narrative, or at least African women essentially trying to empower ourselves and put ourselves in the frontier spaces. I often find that there is I guess, like a tendency to essentialize gender as a way to, I guess, characterize or at least state that we should be out in the forefront. A lot of it's often very corporal, a lot of it's often which it should be, right? Because those experiences are also very meaningful. But I often find that with womanists or feminists that are born as female or are female identifying, they can often exclude queer people and people that are at the intersections when it comes to gender, or like gender fluid people. And this is like an important thing for Africans of all genders, I guess, to really focus on. I mean, a lot of our countries, in terms of the laws that are against like people that are homosexual or queer people, it's like in terms of understanding how gender plays into that. And I guess what we want to achieve is like African women, if you want to put it that way. I definitely think it should be something that is paramount and something that is also featured on panels such as this, which is amazing. But I often think that I feel like sometimes when we are trying to achieve for these ideas of greatness, some people can be left out. But I think it's just, I don't know what the question I wanted to ask, I guess, is how do you deal with those ambivalences in terms of, you can only know so much, not know so much, but I guess that, based on the people that you interact with every day, and sometimes some things might be missed. How do you put towards an effort to make sure that everybody is kind of rising up together, and we're not, I guess, reifying the same structures that left us out in the cold for others? Yeah.
I think it's important for us to center the people who we're speaking for or for those people to actually be the people that are speaking. I think what's happening a lot of the times is that when speaking for, there's a need to sort of make the narrative palatable to the hegemonic discourse. So it's always like trying to sort of reinforce the existing narrative without actually realizing that in itself we're supposed to be outside it. It's like just being the like I think the most difficult thing is that elites are very uncomfortable with being outside that comfortable space. And I think what needs to just happen is that for us to rest a bit in that uncomfortable space, because us, the subalterns, have been resting there all our lives. And I think it's their turn for them to just be there and act. If they are going to write about subjects that are perhaps that are not their experiences, I think they need to center those voices. Those voices cannot be mere participants in the study. I think they need to actually be the writers of those stories. I think they should merely act as agents, but not the tellers of those stories. And I think what's been happening is that they've been retelling those stories just to fit their own agendas. And there's been erasure, like you're saying, of certain voices. Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question also, because I think the most difficult thing about this is like there are no clear-cut answers. And also, I don't fall within the elite group myself. I do have my privileges, but I don't fall within the elite group. So it's also a very difficult space to navigate. So I think we also need to be like honest about that.
When you were referring to elites, what do you mean? I think also not to get caught up in this idea of elite is stagnant, and also, or at least the way that I see it, elite is often based on your positioning, right? So I guess in some spaces, somebody from the diaspora, socioeconomically, I might be considered elite, you know, in certain spaces to, not to use the wrong word, but like continental Africans or Africans that have lived on the continent for a very long time. And yeah, I think that I often try to let go of what my concept of elite is in terms of like this white man that is very much in like an ivory tower. Because I think that, as you said, like rightfully so, it often leads us to telling stories that we might not be in a position to. Sorry, there's a lot of questions, but yeah.
I definitely agree, and that's why I did clarify that I too have my privileges that render me an elite too. Yeah, so I too have my privileges that render me an elite. And I think, like you're saying, it's not stagnant, that it's always shifting, that in some spaces I will be the elite. I will be the person who has the most power in the room. So I think that reflexivity in itself and like thinking about that positionality, I think we have an onus in ourselves to always just think about the power that we yield in those spaces and how, again, like I'm saying that if I'm the person who holds the power in that relationship and I'm the one telling the story, I shouldn't be the one speaking for. Like at most I should be acting as an agent and just trying to articulate what the other person is trying to say, but I shouldn't attempt to reinterpret so as to fit my own political views or to please a certain grant that I've received. I think that a lot of that has been happening. I think there's been a lot of like instrumentalization of voices so as to just get a grant or get money or just feed into the wider narrative. And I think that's what I'm just pushing back on. Yeah.
There's a guy behind him.
Yes, I think there's a question. Mike?
Kindly ask that you make your questions short so we can get a few more thoughts. Because we don't have infinite amounts. It's a huge topic. Thank you.
Sorry. Yes, John? Yes, you have a question? Oh, sorry, I thought you had a question. Yes, or if anybody else? Yes, at the back? Yeah, hi.
Yeah, thanks to the very wonderful panel for your very beautiful talks. I think I just have like two short questions. One is, you did mention something about being the only all-female panel. I think this is probably one of the only all-female panels I've seen. I guess on my end, the question is like very simple in the sense that for a lot of, issues, you have very few subject matter experts that are women. So I have sat on like tables when people are trying to like create like panels like this, and then they're trying to look for the experts, but they're just not there. So it's like, it becomes a system that builds on itself. It's like when someone is wealthy and another person is poor, the wealthier gets richer and the poor person gets poorer. So it's kind of like the question of how do we really break that kind of vicious circle? I guess my second question is about the issue of telling the story and who really tells what the narrative is. I guess in that sense, it becomes a question of how do we now clear the issue of misinformation or disinformation, as we have seen with like social media, Twitter being a very good example where it's supposed to be a space for people to freely talk about whatever it is, but then you can see all the kind of false narratives. Nigeria's election, for instance, that Aruma is following very closely, and things like that. So I think for me, those are like the two kind of big questions. And I would really love to get your insight on this because fun fact is we're organizing a conference currently, and I've been working so hard to get women to participate in the panels, and it's been very difficult.
Thank you.
So Emeka is the chair of the Africa Society, and I think it'll be nice if people will introduce themselves. And I'm guilty because he reached out to me not to be a speaker, to get a female speaker, but he's a very ambitious young man. So he reached out to me, to someone who said to me, please don't ask me again. Everybody asks me. And if I mention the name, you'll understand, but I wouldn't mention her name. Because everybody asks me to ask her if she can come to a conference at Oxford. And she's like, please, you know my schedule, don't ask me again. But I think Emeka's question is a very important one. And I remember as treasurer at the World Bank, one of my colleagues, who's a female senior leader who worked with me, I said, it'll be lovely just to have women on our panels. And so we had a rule in the treasury of the World Bank where we would make sure that we invited women. And some of what we found was every time we invited a woman, they always had something else to do, and they passed it on to their male colleagues who were always available. So there's a whole issue around it. So some of what I do is coach women around, don't feel that you're not able to do something, just accept. I need to say that to myself all the time, but because I'm the same way. So part of it is a whole ecosystem about how you support women to succeed more generally. So I just wanted to address that issue around, it's your point around, the wealthy will invite the wealthy, and that's true. That means you have to make conscious effort, and that's why us sitting in this room, I've learned quite a bit just listening to everyone who's spoken as to what I can do differently as a result of the fact that because of Gina, we're all gathered here. And if you didn't take that step of making yourself available, arriving yesterday from Kenya just so you could be with us at Oxford, we would not have this conversation. So I wanted to just react to the first question.
I think the other thing is that, even when you're interviewing, which I did in my business, men and women, the men would very clearly take ownership for the work they've done, and they'll say, I did this project, and because of me, the business grew. But when you're interviewing the woman, they never take, they will never take, they're so humble, the humility is so much, and they're just so afraid of taking ownership of the incredible work that they've sometimes done. So I think there is a difference there.
That's a really interesting point. We've actually found something similar. And now when we hire for new positions, we've found that women only apply when they're sure that they hit all of the points that are looked for on a profile. And actually men will apply when they don't necessarily fit all of them. And they will do so with great charm and confidence, not to generalize. But we now include a piece at the bottom that says, if you don't feel like you fit all of those criteria, but you feel like this is a place you'd like to be, we'd love to have a conversation. And I think it's just creating space for that so that it's not, people aren't excluded prematurely, and actually it's a conversation. I think, Sabrina, you were going to say something, and then I'm very conscious of time, so I think reluctantly, we will have to.
Wanted to comment on the expert point. Yeah, when David first called me to join this panel, it's like, I think the second thing that I said to him is like, I don't feel I'm qualified for this. So I think I'm going to pass. and then I remember just like thinking about it, and I was like, okay, what does it mean to necessarily be an expert in a particular thing? And also thinking like other panels that I've attended and how most of the times I don't necessarily identify with the viewpoints that are shared. And I think the most that you can guarantee is that you're an expert of your own experiences. I don't think you could ever be an expert in general, because even sitting in class sometimes, I have lecturers who will be experts on, I'm from Zimbabwe, by the way, and they'll be experts on Zimbabwe. And I have lived experiences of Zimbabwe, and their expertise and their understanding of Zimbabwe is totally different from my understanding. And sometimes I sit there and I ask myself, like, is it the fact that their detachment from Zimbabwe and the fact that they have a degree from Oxford or a degree from Harvard, does that render them more of an expert just because of that? And do my experiences basically count for nothing? So I think that like we should really center our experiences, and I think at most we can just guarantee that we're experts of our experiences, and that's all we can speak on. Yeah.
Do we have? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hi. Can we get a mic, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, we'll come to you in a second.
My question is for Sabrina. You mentioned something about the power structures and the different ways in which people actively misunderstand African women's voices on their stories. There is an organization called Africa No Filter. They are working to educate people about how to tell stories about Africa. It is aimed primarily at journalists, African journalists at that. So as an African, how do you portray Africa without reproducing all the stereotypes and all of that? So my question is basically, what chance do they have, you know, if there are structures that are so powerful and their interests are not in Africa and they are actively misunderstanding the African story?
Sure. I'm sorry. Well, sorry. Just to repeat the question. The question is, what chance do they stand? I'm not particularly sure. I think it's a great initiative, the fact that that they recognize that this is a problem that's taking place. In terms of their chances, I don't know if I can particularly speak on on that point. I'm honestly hoping for the best for them, because, well, I hope to benefit from them too. Yeah, I don't really think I could.
Sorry. So, you know, we're sitting here in the city of Dreaming Spires. Last year, Oxford was surveyed as the most woke city in the United Kingdom. So, in terms of it's shocking, the small percentage of women on boards of directors of listed companies. Do you think it would be woke just to have women as token directors, or do you believe that they should get it by merit, if you see what I mean?
Arima, just take one.
So what is merit? Is always the question I ask.
When people say, should they get it by merit? What you've seen around the world with organizations and with stock exchanges around the world that understand the value of diversity, is that there is much more of an effort to make sure that you have a diversity of opinion, starting with issues around making sure that there are more women on boards. And the Nordic countries have taken the lead in this. And in some cases, they have quotas. And I sit on several boards, and sometimes I listen to the conversation and I'm thinking, my God, you know, I better speak up, because if somebody thinks I'm associated with some of the direction of these conversations, then, you know, something would go wrong. And my colleagues are always very open and available. So I think, so that's one. So what is merit? The second reaction to such an important issue that you've shared is that usually the minority attribute, whether gender or race or whatever it is, people tend to be overqualified. So if you're really looking, I mean, if it's women and you're looking for women on boards, there's enough women who are absolutely more qualified than some of the men that I've seen on boards. And so part of it is also the power structure, but some of it is just lack of knowledge. You know, people don't even think about it. I belong to a women's network that is women on boards. And some of my colleagues have been the first one who have joined a board. And their reaction is like, there's no way I'm going to do this. I'm the only woman on this board. I'm like, no, if you don't accept, we'll never get anybody else on the board. So I do think it's an important issue. I do think that we need to question what does merit mean. And when you're on a board, which basically determines the future of a company, the future of a society, diversity of thought is extremely important. And diversity of thought starts with who people are and their lived experiences. But it's a big issue, so I hope I kind of summarized my response. It's always something I'm passionate about. Yeah. So.
Thank you, everybody. I think very reluctantly we're going to have to draw it to a close. We could continue for a while. Just as we close, if we could have the last slide. I just wanted to leave everybody with some examples of platforms where you can find incredible stories of African women in all their diversity, in all their beauty, and all the celebration of everything that makes African women inspirational. And I think we can, I go discover, and I hope it's of interest. Anne, I think, great.
Wow.
Thank you.
What can I say? I mean, what do you say to such a panel? What do you say to such a discussion? I'm sure your year is off to a wonderful start. Can we please give a round of applause to this wonderful panel? I think we do have a name for an all-male panel. They're called manels. I don't know what we're going to call an all-female panel. I'm excited that this becomes a norm, that we don't even need a name for it. It's so normalized. This has been such a wonderful discussion. I want to personally thank Natalie for bringing this all to a wonderful moderation and making it all as, a wonderful, engaging conversation, and for bringing in Africa Practice as a wonderful partner to do this. I want to thank Sabrina for always bringing her, wonderful insights to everything. The first conversation I had with Sabrina was, hi, how are you? I want to discuss the politics of desirability on African women. And my mind was blown. And for 15 minutes, I am absolutely in awe and in utter admiration of her brilliance. Thank you, Sabrina. I want to thank my wonderful friend, my hero, my inspiration, Arumna, who's always there whenever we call her. Knowing how busy and hectic her schedule is, I can bet that with a smile and a big hug, she will come and she will hear us and she will share her wonderful expertise. Thank you so much, our sister, our friend, our wonderful inspiration, Arumna. And of course, it's, the reason we're here, Gina. Thank you so much for spending the time when we're all in our pajamas in lockdown, writing this wonderful piece of work. It's funny how Arumna and I come from very different, backgrounds and homes for that matter, but we all could find ourselves, a piece of ourselves in this story. So I encourage you all to take some time and read it and enjoy and imbibe the beauty and the intelligence that's coming out of that book. It's funny because I grew up not so far away from Nanyuki, so I could see the pictures in my own head while reading it. So I encourage you to get the book. And thank you so much, Gina, for being here, for choosing Oxford as your first place to launch your book. Thank you. And on that long list of thank you, of course, I will thank our Kenya High Commissioner for making it possible for some of us to be in this country in the first place, and for the office that he represents. So I want to invite very quickly for a thanks note from the Kenya Society that have come all the way from London to share their warm regards to Gina and to the team. And then we will close with that. Mrs. Barry, welcome.
McKenna, thank you for inviting us. And thank you, ladies, for a very, very electric evening. Thank you. So I come in the role as Deputy Chair of Kenya Society. Sorry, I come in the role of Deputy Chair of Kenya Society, which is a diaspora organization for Kenya and basically the whole of East Africa. So as Deputy Chair, I bring this gift to you from all your many, many fans. And we hope to see you in London soon.
Definitely.
Just a quick note, on a personal level, this has been so meaningful as the first lady deputy chair of the Kenya Society. Oh, ladies, I am going to leave here with my head in the clouds. So thank you. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. This has just been absolutely amazing. Thank you, Natalie, for putting this together. Before we leave, I'd like to do something that, as African women, we do. We've made some blankets for Daughter of Africa, shawls, and I would like to, Aruma, you want to be first? And what we like to do as women is to wrap other women in support and love and care, and I hope this will be a reminder of this.
Absolutely stunning. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's so special. By the way, one of the things you learn about Africa is that, you know, those who should get gifts give you gifts. So, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
The incredible My Neighbor in Kenya. This is for you. It's different, but so it's a longer one.
Thank you. So grateful.
You guys need it in this weather, believe me.
And Yuki too.
Yes, Annie and Yuki. Sabrina, this is for you. There you go.
Thank you.
I hope you ladies who got them feel loved and supported, and you go forward and tell your story. Thank you very much, everyone.